Okay, all right, great. Well, welcome to everyone to today's Consciousness Club. Do feel free, if you wish, to leave your cameras on. But if you just make sure you're muted so we can easily hear the speaker, that would be great. So it's a real pleasure today to be hosting Tessa Dekker, so our UCL colleague. Tessa obtained her PhD at the Center for Brain and Cognitive Development at Birkbeck University. And then for a postdoc, she worked with Marco Nardini at the UCL Institute of Ophthalmology, studying how the developing brain learns to combine different signals from the senses. In 2016, she became a research fellow at UCL Division of Language and Psychology on a ESRC Future Leaders Fellowship. She was then awarded a Moorfields Career Development Award to investigate visual development in eye diseases. And since 2020, she's been Associate Professor and Director of the Child Vision Lab at the Institute of Ophthalmology and the Department of Experimental Psychology at UCL. So we're very excited to have you join us, Tessa, and to provide this this perspective on vision and consciousness from the perspective of development, which I think is a really important one to hear from. So over to you, take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'm excited to be here. And so what I'm going to present today is some of my slightly older work on sensory integration and things like that. And because I think it probably is relevant to the things you're interested in. And I hope it will raise some cool discussions and maybe inspire some new research in this direction. So in my lab, we are interested in how visual cognition develops normally and in eye disease. And in particular, we're interested in understanding how early typical and altered visual experiences shape our brain development and our later cognitive abilities in a broader sense. And of course, what we can do as humans with our vision is unparalleled in any other animal, and also really still in AI, despite huge advances in this field. And a very obvious example is, of course, our ability to seamlessly recognize abstract symbols like letters and use them to transmit complex concepts. And in fact, until recently, the ability to recognize these shapes under distorted and occluded conditions was a safety precaution to discriminate, to check that observers were actually human. So this is really quite an important human ability. Now, in contrast to our kind of unique visual cognitive proficiency in adulthood, is a strikingly slow, is this playing? Yeah. Visual motor development early in life. So here you see a recording of an infant macaque. I guess I need to hover over it for it to work. At 2 weeks, and a human at 2 months, both reaching towards the target. And it's very clear that one of these infants is more proficient, and it's not the human. And so it's really like we're born really helpless. And this is also paired with uniquely prolonged brain development. For example, as many people here will know, our brains grow really quite substantially in size after birth up until around age 7. This is accompanied by prolonged development of fundamental neuroarchitectural properties like the establishment of, and first the establishment and then the refinement of synaptic arbораtions and connections that support efficient communication between neurons. And this is also paired with prolonged myelination of neuronal tracts, which enable faster and more efficient brain-wide communication. To some degree, this prolonged development may be a side effect of the fact that we're really born quite immature due to the fact that we're bipedal and that our heads can't really get very big or they won't fit to the birth canal. But it's also likely and supposed by many people that the high degree of helplessness early in life is somehow advantageous. So here, taking an early hit may actually have some benefit for later cognitive ability. And where we lack a really precise understanding is exactly what this prolonged development of these processes might be advantageous for. And my approach for answering these questions is looking at which abilities take a particularly long time to become adult-like, and so that seemingly pose the greatest developmental challenges to human development. And so I'll present data showing that some abilities that seem really basic, because we adults do them really seamlessly, take really surprisingly long to develop, and are also some of the problems that AI models really struggle with. So these are potentially giving us some clues about hard problems of human cognition. And based on these data, I hypothesize that a major functional benefit of prolonged developmental processes in humans is that it allows us to build more flexible and robust models of the self and the world. So let's delve into this. So as I showed earlier, we're born with very blurry, poor vision, and it takes a lot of time over the first months of life and years of life to acquire and then refine many basic visual skills like seeing color, seeing motion, recognizing shapes. But some visual skills take a really long time to develop and seem to be particularly difficult, and they take until well into childhood to develop. So here are just some examples. So the ability to integrate shapes that are embedded in noise, or detect motion embedded in noise, recognizing faces or any other type of familiar object that's made a bit harder to recognize, recognizing natural scenes or discriminating them. All these things take up until the early teens to become adult-like. And we were wondering to which extent this could reflect improvements in our ability to use prior knowledge about the world to parse ambiguous visual inputs. And this is work. Oh, no. To test this, we looked at two-tone objects, which I'm sure many people in this meeting will know about, but they're very difficult to recognize images that you create by smoothing and binarizing black and white photos. And the idea is that they're really difficult to recognize at first, like this one, but once you see the original, then when you go back to the two-tone, they become much more easily recognizable. And in fact, recognition is often mandatory. This is called perceptual reorganization, and it's a nice way to test the impact of prior knowledge on perception, because the image is identical before and after cueing, and the only thing that's changed is that you now know what you're seeing. So we wanted to understand the role of how to understand how the ability to use prior knowledge to parse images develops. We looked at these images and looked at how this perceptual reorganization process develops. And this was done by my excellent PhD student, Georgie Milne. So she showed children and adults first a two-tone and asked what was in the picture, then showed the grayscale version and asked what was in that picture, and then morphed it back into the two-tone to make very clear it's the same image. And then we couldn't ask again what's in the picture, because people are not stupid. They'll know that we want to hear the same answer. So we then asked them to point out informative features on the object, like the bear's nose or ear, and see if they were able to do that. So let's have a look at the results. So what we plot here is recognition for just the grayscales, and that's very high. So children know what these objects are. But if we look at the naive two-tone recognition, we see that younger children in particular find this very challenging. They're impaired with respect to adults, in line with what I told you earlier, that children really struggle until very long with recognizing objects as soon as you make them a bit harder to recognize. Now, the key question is, of course, what happens if children know what this is? Can they use the grayscale cue, immediately blurred into the two-tone, to disambiguate the image? And here are the results, and I'll take you through them because the graph is a little bit complex. So what you see in white here, white circles, are pointing performance to these features we asked about for images that the participants could already recognize. So basically for the two tones that they got correct. So this gives us a baseline for ability to point out features when you know what's in the image. So if grayscale cueing helps, then we would expect performance to be on top of these. So if you first didn't know what the two-tone was, then you see the grayscale, and then you get perceptual reorganization, these colored dots, which are depicting that scenario, should go on top of the white dots. And we see that that's the case in adults, but not in children, and especially not in the younger children. So it seems that seeing a grayscale does not help them point out where the features of the objects are. And this is really striking. So you're sitting next to these kids and you're morphing this grayscale into a two-tone. And as an adult, you just can't, it's so obvious what the image is then. You just see it and they just lose it. They just can't point it out. And I had to tell parents, you know, to not tell them off for not trying. They just find it very difficult to do. So if we look at the responses, we can get a little bit more insight in what's going on here. And what you see here in yellow are basically where children pointed when we asked them to touch the mouth and the eye of this lady. On the grayscale, they can do this, of course. And on the two-tone, you see that they're noisier than the adults, shown in purple. But they're also actually systematically wrong in quite a lot of cases, where we asked them to point at the mouth. They're pointing at this little pareidolik face that you might see here in the top of the screen. There's a little cat-like, I think it looks like a cat anyway. So they're pointing at a little mouth and two little eyes here. So they're seemingly doing the task. They're looking for the feature that we're asking for, but they're not integrating the percept. So they're using kind of a local feature approach to solve the problem. And we found that they did this across quite a lot of images, and it really suggests that they're not getting the whole integrated shape from seeing the grayscale, but are trying to solve the task. And we also looked at how human development compares to some deep neural nets. I won't go into too much detail about this here, but we found that just on naive two-tone recognition, the more complex deep neural nets that we looked at performed about as well as a 6-year-old. And also, they did not show any perceptual reorganization, just like a young child, because they basically, we tested that by testing a network that was trained on the grayscale on the corresponding two tones. And they were not, this did not improve their performance over what we see here. Of course, there might be a network out there now that can do this because this field is really rapidly evolving, but we didn't see this being possible. So what this tells us is that use of prior knowledge to parse these two-tone images seems to be particularly challenging, not just for humans, but also for deep neural nets. And yeah, it doesn't become adult-like until at least the age of 7 to 9 years. It seems that rather than integrating information across space to parse the scene, children show a local feature bias, and their performance looks basically a lot like what we see in deep neural nets that often are thought to use visual features rather than to solve object recognition problems. Now, we can't fully exclude that this reflects some kind of low-level process that's still developing, like improved contrast perception. But based on what we know about how these basic skills develop, we don't think that that's the case. We think this might reflect improvement in the ability to use knowledge of the world or develop more robust models of the world. And I want to delve into those explanations a little bit more here. So basically, this two-tone recognition is thought to rely on feedback from higher order brain regions, like frontal cortex and object selective brain regions infused from gyrus and LOC, to a primary visual cortex, based on these types of data that show that the voxel activation pattern in V1 becomes more of to a two-tone image, becomes more like the grayscale once you recognize the two-tone than when you don't recognize it. And this is in V1, which is really visually driven. So this is actually quite striking. Teufel, Dakin, and Fletcher suggested that this feedback might actually be important for basically figure ground segregation by enhancing the relevant boundaries of the object, which they showed by showing that orientation discrimination is better along the illusory contours of the object after recognition, but not before recognition. And this is not the case for perpendicular orientations. Another explanation that I find quite interesting as well. So basically, sorry, what we're suggesting is that what may be developing is that the feedback processes that allow object knowledge to modulate representations in low-level visual cortex, and that this requires efficient long-range communication across brain-wide neural networks. Another explanation that we're really interested in is that the object representations themselves are still developing. So this is a work by Hans Optebeek, this data that I'm showing you here. So basically, representations in low-level brain regions are strongly driven by visual similarity of objects. So here we're seeing two different categories. We're seeing donuts and dogs, and they will have very similar representations in low-level brain regions. But as you move up the hierarchy to these more complex object selective regions and frontal cortex, the representations will become more dissimilar because they're reflecting different categories. So we see a similar process kind of in development. Here, I just wanted to show this cool study by Denis Marichal, Quinn, and French, who showed that infants can discriminate categories, but do so really based on visual statistics. And so if you show children a series of cats, they'll get bored, they'll habituate, and then if you show them suddenly a picture of a dog, their attention will be withdrawn, so they'll get really interested. But if you show them a series of dogs and then suddenly a cat, they won't dishabituate. So this behavior was well explained by a computational model that learns the statistics of image features of these different categories, like the distance between the feet, etc. And the key thing here is that dogs are more variable than cats. So if you present a baby with lots of cats, it will learn the feature distribution, and a dog will then stand out because it will have a lot of different features, so it will draw attention. And the inverse isn't the case because the visual features of cats fit comfortably within the distribution of features of dogs. So I like this kind of as an idea. The kids we tested were obviously a lot older, but we can speculate that truly learning like these multimodal, multidimensional feature space of object categories that you need to build representations that are really robust to visual variations may take a really long time to learn. So yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears to a different set of studies that was inspired by questions about how children form models of their own sensory motor skills and can compute with them. So the world is uncertain because our sensory and motor estimates are noisy and our knowledge of the world is incomplete. And in most scenarios, we basically don't have endless opportunities, unfortunately, to learn how to best navigate all this uncertainty through trial and error. And here in this crossing the road example, the cost would be particularly high. So instead, we can rely on probabilistic inference. So we can build internal models about the uncertainty in our system and the world and use these models to identify strategies that minimize risk. For example, when crossing the road, our judgments of car speeds might not be perfect. They might vary a little bit if we're unbiased around the true speed of the car, as indicated by the width of this probability distribution. And when it gets foggy, the variability might increase. And in that case, we might do some decision making and decide to rely more on another noisy sensory cue, like an auditory cue to car speeds, or we might decide to cross the road a little bit more carefully to reduce risk. So adults can make these sensory decisions very efficiently and seem to rely on these types of internal models. For example, when judging the depth of this inner square, you can use its binocular disparity, which is basically the difference in the location of the square for the left and right eye, which gives you a cue to depth. So that's here the depth estimate from binocular disparity. That's the cue that they use in 3D cinemas. You can also use relative motion, which is basically the slight difference in speed across your retina of this square with respect to the surround. Now, both cues are informative about depth, so it's not the best thing to do to just pick one of these cues. The best thing to do is to use both of them. And the statistically optimal thing to do is to basically compute a weighted average of both cues. So you arrive at an averaged or fused depth estimate that is more reliable or peaked than the best single cue. And adult perception is well described and well studied by this ideal sensory fusion model across a wide range of tasks and sensory cue integration combinations. And so it was really surprising back in around 2008 when Marco Nardini and Monica Gori found that it takes children a very long time to learn this optimal type of sensory integration. So instead, kids might only use one cue and ignore useful information, or they might rely on a really unreliable sensory cue. Why? It's really puzzling question. So we were wondering, Marco Nardini, my supervisor for my postdoc, we were wondering whether these very basic seeming mechanisms are just not in place, or whether the brain actually computes this information, but children are not actually using it in the tasks that we asked them to do in the lab. Okay, that's what we asked. And so to test this, we looked at integration of disparity and motion cues to depth. So we first measured when children start combining these depth cues behaviorally, like adults. And then we tested for sensory fusion in the brain before and after this perceptual shift. Now, this is not really trivial because MRI measures collapse across thousands of neurons within a voxel. So it's tricky to discriminate between a mechanism that keeps cues separate within neuronal detectors like this one, or that fuses them within neuronal detectors, because both basically contain more depth information if both cues are present. So we introduced a conflict to our stimulus, shown in this tiny little image here. So basically what we reasoned is that a mechanism that keeps cues, fuses cues, if you show an extreme conflict situation where one cue is in front of the surround and the other cue is behind the surround, if you average those cues, the end result will be a flat plane, basically. So it will reduce your depth information. Any conflict will reduce depth information. So a mechanism that fuses cues together will be basically hurt by having a conflict in the cue and will benefit from having the cues in alignment. And a mechanism that keeps the cues separate won't care whether they're aligned or not, because it keeps them separate anyway. So basically, this was our criterion for sensory integration or fusion, that performance should be better for congruent cues than for conflicting depth cues. So to test this, we use psychophysics, and here is just a marker of when children start performing better with congruent than conflicting cues. And we see that this starts happening between the ages of 10 to 11, which is very much in line with other sensory cue combinations and the literature. And then to see what happened before and after this shift, we asked these children in cyan to come back for an MRI study. And here are some results. So these are results from older children. And what you see here is basically the ability of a support vector machine, a decoding algorithm, to decode the depth of the plane that the children were looking at, the depth of the square, based on the voxel activation pattern in regions of interest. So we can see that we can decode depth really well in both V1 and V3B, which is associated with sensory integration in adults. And so the key thing to note here is that in V3B, we see much better depth decoding, significantly better depth decoding when the depth cues are congruent compared to when they are in conflict. And again, this pattern is very similar as what you see in adults, and it's restricted really to this region together with some other markers of sensory integration. So the older children look like adults, basically, and meet our criterion for sensory fusion within neural detectors. Now, if we look at the younger kids, we did not see this marker or any markers of sensory fusion in area V3B. So from this, we concluded that the mechanisms that are giving rise to fused neural estimates are still developing, and that's why children do not optimally combine visual depth cues. So, of course, the next question is, okay, what is it actually that children are learning? And I haven't done a lot of recent work in this area, but I just wanted to present some cool studies by other groups that have made some really nice headway towards understanding this. So work by Brigitte Roeder's group shows that young children can actually integrate visual and auditory cues, but they do this to a lesser extent than adults. So in their model, their model builds in a causal inference process. So basically, it allows you to arbitrate between the possibility that the cues have two causes. So the auditory and visual cue come from two separate causes versus one single common cause. And so you can integrate cues in varying degrees depending on your belief that it's a single cause or a two separate causes. And what they found is that young children can integrate, but their behavior is explained by a weaker common cause assumption. So that's, I think, quite interesting. And maybe further refined by work by Marco Nardini and James Nagin, which shows that young children can also optimally integrate audio and visual cues after extensive training with the single cues. So not with the combined cues, but with the single cues, which suggests that they're maybe still learning the biases and the reliabilities of the sensory cues, and that's really important for learning how to integrate these cues. So yeah, I think interesting literature it is. So basically, knowing the uncertainty in visual motor estimates is important for optimizing performance across many tasks, not just sensory integration, but a lot of visual motor tasks. So this could have wide impacts. And that's also here illustrated by this example. So imagine that you have to hit this apple with an arrow. And if you miss the apple, you'll get a huge, horrible penalty that you really don't want. But of course, you also really don't want to hit this little boy. So if you want to kind of maximize an overall outcome for a happy outcome for everyone, you might want to shift your arrow up a tiny little bit. And the critical thing here is that how much you need to shift depends on your own sensory motor uncertainty. So if you're less precise, you need to shift further. So what this basically means is that you don't have to do too much trial and error and with potential horrible consequences here to learn what the best strategy is. You could also solve this problem in one go and find the ideal strategy if you know your sensory motor uncertainty and the outcomes of all the potential outcomes, the consequences of all potential outcomes. And then by combining this information, you can compute what the optimal strategy is here. And Julia Trommershauser, Mike Landy, and Larry Maloney showed that adults are actually able to solve this problem quite quickly without much learning. So it seems that they're possibly doing some kind of computation like this. So we borrowed their task to see how this ability develops. So like in the example with the apple, we asked children to make rapid reaches to a target. And because they have to do it really quickly, there's a distribution around the aiming point and so they have to hit the target and avoid this penalty region. And the implicit task is to basically place your distribution on the location within the target that maximizes, or within the display, that maximizes your overall outcome in the long run, given the probabilistic endpoints. Now, because we can measure individual people's visual motor distribution and we know the costs and gains associated with each outcome, we can compute for each aiming strategy in the entire display what the expected winnings are, and we can work out what the ideal location is to aim for. And here, this example adult does a very good job of finding this location, and this is very much in line with what these guys found. So adults are really good at this task very quickly, without any evident learning at least, seem to be able to find the ideal strategy. I see some nodding. Okay, so here we see a cross section of the gain landscape. So let's see what children do here. Here are the results. And this is a cross section of the gain landscape that I showed you before. And on the x-axis is the deviation from the ideal strategy along the display. And on the y-axis is the score, both the score people obtained and the predicted score, which is indicated by the curve here. So basically what you see is that adults' aiming points are very close to the ideal location, indicated by the dotted line, and that they're scoring pretty much as well as could be predicted based on their ideal strategy. Does that make sense? Okay. So yeah. Now, if we look at children, and especially let's focus on this younger group, what we see is that they're deviating away from the ideal location, and they're constantly getting feedback, right? So they're doing this stubbornly, despite not getting very many points. And this is really important because they basically already are a little bit at a disadvantage. Their ideal strategy can't win as many points as the adults can. So this peak is a bit lower in children than in adults because they're less precise. But then on top of that, they're really losing way more points than that just by picking a suboptimal strategy. So this, I think, raises an important possibility that a large part of the improvements in visual motor performance we see in childhood might not just be that children are less precise, but that they are making poor probabilistic inferences. So this is important because children have many more accidents than adults do, and this might be one of the reasons, and maybe there's something we can do about it. But it might be interesting to be a bit more specific about what children might be learning here. And I don't really have an answer. We can have done some modeling and we've done some control tests, but yeah, there's still quite a lot of open questions here. But one thing is that possibility is that they're doing probabilistic inference, but they're doing the same computation as adults, but they're using distorted representations of visual motor precision. So in this case, this would require them to think that they're nearly perfectly precise, which maybe is not super realistic. Or they might misjudge the costs. They might have a poor representation of what it means to lose 5 points and that it's 5 times worse than losing 1 point, etc. So, but we did do a lot of checks to make sure that they understood those point systems. So we don't think that's very likely. Another possibility is that they're doing probabilistic inference like adults and that they're actually doing this quite well, but that they're affected by some biases. For example, here you have to point away from the center of the configuration to be optimal, and maybe that's very difficult for kids. And finally, it's possible that they're not actually doing the same type of task, or that they're switching between something like probabilistic inference and something else. And this is actually quite hard to really model or see. But I think that's a really interesting possibility, and my next study speaks to this a little bit. So here we ask children to basically reach for the middle of a dot cloud to find hidden targets that were centered on a bivariate distribution from which these dots were sampled. So they were randomly sampled from these dots. So the ideal strategy is to calculate the middle of the dots. We told children this, you have to find the mean of the dots, and we trained them extensively on finding the mean of the dots. So then we asked them to do this task, and we fit both adults and children. And we fit a wide range of middle finding strategies to the data to see what averaging strategy people were actually using. And what we find is that adults kind of across the board, their performance is best explained by just finding the mean of the dot cloud, which they were trained on, and what gave them the best points. Whereas children did something a bit more complex. Their data was really well explained by this convex hull. strategy that we called convex hull, but basically what they did was basically draw an outline around the dots and then find the center of gravity of it. And so it's not wrong, they're finding a middle, but it's not the optimal way of finding the middle. This didn't, and it cost them performance. It added a bit of imprecision. So it wasn't a hard constraint, but because we saw that when there were more dots and this becomes less tractable as a task, they shifted to a mean finding strategy. So what this tells us is it really shows that children don't always just use adult-like strategies suboptimally. So we have to be really careful in assuming that they may use completely different strategies altogether. And I don't think this is trivial. I don't think it's trivial that children might just use a different strategy, because I think that developing a better model of the world may involve building an intuitive understanding of the problem structure of new tasks and understanding basically what the world is asking for us. And this could be termed structural learning. And then understand the problem space so that you can understand what the best computations are to solve these problems. So I think this is quite an interesting area for development to look into. Of course, this all raises an issue. As I'm sure you've all noticed, these tasks are quite abstract. And when we're talking about understanding problem structures, these are really probably not very intuitive or close to what the kids experience a lot. So it's possible that children are able to build and use self-models in a more optimal adult-like way when the tasks themselves are more realistic and intuitive. So to test this, my postdoc, Imogen Large, developed a VR task. And in this task, we asked participants to pop balloons as they fell from the left or the right pipe. And the aim was to score as many points as possible. And participants, sorry, make a nice animation in case you didn't know what I mean with popping balloons from the left and right pipe. There you go. That's what I mean. And participants were able to walk freely around the display and position themselves where they thought they would win the most points. And the pipes could vary in their value. So what the pipe could be worth 2 points, one of them, or 3 points. And so you have to trade off your position against the value of the pipe. So you have to understand how your ability to hit the balloons changes as you trade off position between the two pipes. And before this free movement task that we asked them to do, first we asked participants to intercept the balloons from 7 fixed positions along this trajectory. So we could basically map out how probability changed as a function of position. This is what you show here. So you see that as you move away from the red pipe, your hit rate decreases. Same for as you move away from the blue pipe. And this dotted line gives the overall hit probability across the landscape. And you can see that there's an optimal location somewhere here. And for the second participant, there's also an optimal location, but it's in a slightly different place. And this is important because people use different strategies and have different locations depending on their idiosyncratic way of doing this task, which we didn't control, but could quantify. So it's also important, this was done before the task. So participants had a chance to learn how the task, how performance changed across the task. Now, what happens when they're then able to freely move? Do they go and stand in the position where they can score the most points? And here you see the results for the one equal value condition. So this is what they were trained on. And you see that there's a correlation between the optimal location and where participants actually stood. So basically, participants can learn where they should stand to win the most points when we're looking at adults, at least. Now, what happens if we introduce a completely new game landscape, which they have not had any experience with, where one of the pipes becomes suddenly worth more points? And it looks like adults can very quickly work out where to position themselves when the game landscape changes. Especially, we found a significant like match between the optimal and observed location for the 3 versus 1 condition. So in this more realistic task, we see that adults are able to solve these problems really quickly. What about children? Here are the results. We basically, they're basically rubbish. Sorry, children. They don't seem to learn where to position themselves in this task, which is really intuitive and really fun for them, but they don't really learn where to stand to get as many points as possible. They seem to be just moving all over the place. They move a lot more than adults do as well. They don't even learn the ideal strategy where they had experience in, and they certainly don't translate to new game landscapes. So again, lots of interesting avenues to further explore here. To conclude, from these last sets of studies, efficient probabilistic inference is a substantial challenge in human visual development that is potentially underappreciated as a contributor to poor childhood visual motor even performance. Children may still be developing robust models of their own bodies and of how their bodies interact with the world. And this might include some more complex type of models, like an intuitive understanding of complex problem spaces and their best solutions. And what I kind of want to put forward is that the prolonged development that we have, and maybe even this very poor visual motor skills that we have early in life, might be helpful for building these more complex models, which we can use to quickly predict how to best solve problems in new, complex, and ambiguous environments and tasks. Would be nice to discuss this. So basically, on the whole, I think what I wanted to present here is that by looking at these tasks that children really struggle with, there is an emergent picture that many of these tasks heavily rely on robust self and world models, and that these basically pose particular challenges to human cognitive development. Maybe this is one of the really hard problems that our brain needs to solve, and maybe something that makes human intelligence relatively unique. It'd be nice to hear what other people think about this. Then on top of that, I think that by studying how children can acquire these skills and really get a handle on the mechanisms, both at the brain level and at the computational level, that allow them to become better, we can start to uncover the computations and architectures that enable these more complex aspects of human cognition. And some of these aspects that I mentioned here in this talk are abstract conceptual knowledge, hierarchical integration of information across neural networks that enable knowledge to feed back on input stages, metacognition, and structural learning. And I want to thank my awesome lab, who are all super lovely and brilliant, and I'm very lucky to work with them. Lots of people, and especially lots of children and schools who've contributed these data, and funders. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tessa. First of all, let's